In today's tutorial, we are going to be having a look at 3D camera tracking in After Effects, mixing that with some real world footage. Just a nice way to step up your videos, you know, just helps create a little bit of spice. It's pretty straightforward, but we're going to make it look really, really sick. So without further ado, let's hop straight into After Effects, where I don't have any composition set up yet. I only have 3 folders with nothing in them. So I'm just going to open my folders with my assets. I'm going to drag all of them into the assets folder in here that I've made just to keep it nice and organized. The way the 3D camera tracker works in After Effects, you need to have the composition kind of match the settings of the footage you're using. So we're going to start by tracking it first, and then we're going to pre-comp it and put it in its own composition and kind of work with it through there. So let's start with our first scene that we want, and I want to take this little scene here, and I'm just going to drag it and create a composition based on it. And if I hit Command K, I can see the composition settings. So I know it's 30 frames per second and 4K. So pretty good with that. And I just want to use a tiny snippet of this. So I'm just going to scroll to a point where I think looks pretty good. I think maybe here with this taxi coming through is pretty sick. Right around, let's start it right here. So I'm just going to drag this up. You can also hit B to mark the beginning of your composition. And then if you play it, you just have a tiny little section playing through, and we don't even need that many seconds. So I'm just going to play through right about here and then hit N. And I can right click on this little bar and trim comp to work area. So now we have a nice little composition here, and we're going to be using the tracker that I have up here. If you don't have it, you can go into window, go down to tracker, and once you have that selected, it should pop up somewhere on your screen. And then we are simply going to hit track camera. And while it's doing that, I'm going to open the advanced tab and make sure that I have detailed analysis on. Just going to give us a little bit of a nicer result. May take a little longer, but it's worth it in the end. This process depends on just how good your computer or laptop is. And just like that, it is done. And if I take the track point size and just increase it a little bit so we can see them a little bit better, and that's all of these, you can see it's done a pretty good job of tracking all of this, and it's given us a whole bunch of points. And we can also increase the target size, which is this little marker that we get right here. But it's not too important. It's just going to make it a little bit easier to see if we want to place something in the distance over here on one of these buildings. We want to keep in mind, okay, where do we want our text, photo, or video to be at? Because that's going to decide where we place this target point. I want it to be kind of like down this alley a little bit, so I'm going to find a spot that looks pretty nice. This is just about scoping around and seeing some points that you think look pretty flat, and I want it to be kind of like it's in the perspective in the distance over this way. In this area right here, I think that'll work very, very well. And then I'm just going to right click and create solid and camera. We can see we have this little bit here, and it's just staying right in line, which is perfect. And we can always change the rotation and position of it afterwards, but this gives us a fairly easy starting point. Now we are going to take this, select the solid that it created, and then hit Shift Command C to bring up the pre-compose options. And then we are going to leave all the attributes in the camera, and we'll name this Scene 1 Tracked Solid Pre, just so we know what it is, and hit OK. And we can go into our project folder in here. We want to make sure that we take this one and drag it into the pre-comps. And we can even rename this folder by hitting Command K and just name this Scene 1 Pre. Make sure that we have that dragged into the pre-comps folder as well. That way we stay nice and organized. We can open this one up and we can change the composition size of this. So if you hit Command K, you can open that up and you can change it to whatever size you want it to be. This is pretty much a 4K square, so it should be plenty. And we just hide that or even delete it. And then we can put in whatever we want. You can drag in an image, you can drag in another video clip, or in our case, a little text layer. So I'm going to select my text tool up here and just click, and let's type out a very special word to me, subscribe, and put that right in the middle of this, and maybe even scale it up a little bit so it fills it out pretty nice, and make sure that is centered. And that is pretty much all I'm going to do for this. And then we can go back, and now we can see we have this text tracked in exactly where we had the solid. We can hit S on our pre-comp folder and scale it up if we want it to be any bigger, kind of like that maybe. And then hit R, since it is a 3D layer, we can mess around with the rotation of it, and let's get it a little bit more flat looking, just like that. And that is the first step of creating this little bit of text. Now the next step of actually making this feel like it's actually a part of the scene is doing just a little bit of masking and rotor work. And to do that, I'm gonna take my background layer and duplicate it and just move it up. And in this case, I wanna track these cars out just so we can put the text kind of in the middle ground, so we have some foreground, middle ground, and background, which is just going to make it look more cinematic. So if you double click on your source layer, it'll bring up just the layer controls, and then you can hit the rotor tool, which will be up here, and then you can start masking. So in this case, let's start with the taxi. I'm just going to draw over the taxi here and see kind of the results that we get. Neewer After Effects should be pretty good at getting this pretty spot on. And it's just a simple task of kind of masking out and subtracting. And then in this case, I started in the middle. Usually you want to start in the beginning, but then I'm just going to hit Command and use the arrow keys to go back and forth between the frames, just to make sure that our masking looks pretty good. And I'm just going to do that ever so slowly, frame by frame, and kind of adjusting like right here, maybe just a little bit. And then you can always hold Alt, which is going to remove from your selection. So if it messes up a little bit, you just do that. And then you just want to move through the composition and make sure that the tracking is pretty good. Like here, I can see that we're missing this top sign, which we obviously want in as well. So I'm just going to go in and draw that in and make sure that we get that as well. And just like that, we now have our little sequence here with the rotoscoping. And then if we go back into the composition, we can now see that our text is now behind the car. So if we play this back, we'll have this little scene here with the car coming in and being in front of it. And we of course want to do it again. So if we duplicate this layer, or if we first rename it and just name this taxi, and then duplicate it and rename this gray car, I think it is, and then remove the roto brush, and you can even remove the track as well because we don't need it on this layer. It's just extra work that it's doing, so you can remove that and then double click on the gray car layer and go to the beginning of the composition and go forward until you find the frame where it first appears, right about here somewhere. And again, select the roto brush tool and mask that out. And then we're just going to repeat that process for everything we want to be in front of the text. That is pretty sweet. And I'll go back, and now we have this taxi coming in, and then we should have the gray car coming in pretty soon as well, just like that. That looks awesome. Then the last bit is you can add a little bit of a drop shadow. So if you duplicate this layer and then open up the rotation, and then we will be laying it flat down like that, and then moving it down. Open up the position or the 2-view mode, and let's drag this one just behind just a little bit, drag it back like that, close that up, and then we will go to fit, and let's change the color of this. So let's add a fill color and change that to a black, kind of like this. Add a little bit of a false box blur, and then decrease the opacity of the layer a good bit like that. And then you can always go in and mess with the position if you want to get it kind of where you want it to be, and that just adds just a little bit more realism in there, maybe something like that. And now we have this nice little text in the background, just something super subtle. But that's it for scene 1. So we can close that up, and then we will want to go into our second scene, which will then be this nice little building. And again, you want to drag it into the composition thing. Again, we want to pick a little bit of just a small little section, maybe right about here. Let's hit B and go forward a little bit and hit N. So we just have this tiny little piece here. Right click on it, trim comp to work area, track camera, go into advanced and detailed analysis, and wait for it to be done. Once again, you can see we get a whole bunch of these points. I'm just going to scale them up a little bit so I have an idea of where they are. And in this case, I think I want to place it kind of on this building, or at least follow that in some sense. So let's go forward a little bit, and I'm going to select a point right here. That looks super sick. I'm going to click on it and then right click and create solid and camera. And then I'm going to, again, pre-comp it, leave all the attributes in there, and then do scene to text pre, and enter that, and then go in and you can hide that. And if we go back into our compositions place, take that, put it in a pre-comps folder. You'll want to take this into the pre-comps folder again. And if we open that up, we can just copy the text or whatever image you have in there, paste it in there, and then just, if we hit Command K, we will just match the size of this pre-comp to the one we had before. That way the scale is the same. So 3840 by 3840, just like that. And then we of course want to drag this out to fit the whole composition. And now if we go back, hit Command K to rename this, and we will name scene to pre. And we have this little itty bitty text over here. So we are going to scale that up a bunch. That looks pretty good. And then move it over just a little bit maybe, and up just like that. And I think this looks pretty cool actually. The only thing I want to do is, again, just a tiny bit of rotoscoping. For this one, I want it to be in between these buildings right here. So I'm gonna, same process, duplicate this bottom layer and drag it on top, and then remove the 3D camera tracker from it because we don't need it. And then double click it to open the roto brush tool. And then we will select the tool, and then we will mask this building right here as one of the ones that we want selected. Make sure all of this is selected. Clean it up just a little bit down here in the reflections, and the same with this building over here. We want it selected as well, Make sure that top bit is selected, same with all these windows. That looks pretty good. And then frame by frame, we're just gonna make sure that our selection stays pretty even. The main thing I'm focused is this area right here where most of it will be shown. That is my main focal point. Roto brush in After Effects has gotten so good. You can pretty much press space, and in scenarios like this, it'll pretty much do it real time without having to do much adjusting. If you used some of the older versions, it might be a little bit worse and you'll have to do more finessing, but it's gotten to a point in at least After Effects 2024 where it's just, I mean, it's so solid. Now we can go back into our composition and bada bing, bada boom, now we have our text in here and that looks pretty sweet. Might even scale it up just a little bit more like that and then move it over to the side a little bit, maybe have it come in here, and might even add a little bit of a position animation. So hit P and move forward to the end of the sequence and just move it over a little bit just so we get a little bit of movement here like it's coming through. Just very, very subtle, and that looks pretty good for scene 2. Same thing with scene 3. This time we've got a little bit of a skyline. I'm gonna drag that in and create a composition based on it, and again select a little bit of a point. I want it to be towards the end here, maybe just right here. So hit B and right click, trim comp to work area. So we just have this nice little piece right here moving in. With it selected, track camera and let After Effects do its thing. And just like that, we have a nice little track. This one should be pretty straightforward. This looks pretty good. Right click, create solid and camera. And then we will again pre-compose this, leave all attributes, and let's do scene 3 track pre, and open that up and close that up and hit Command K. And this time it's super small, so we'll do 3840 by 3840 to keep it the same. Get our text from in here and paste it in. That looks pretty good, and close that up. Now it's super big, which is fine. We actually want it that way, and we should have just ever so just a tiniest bit of movement. And then again, duplicate this, drag it above, and remove the 3D camera tracker. Double click it, and let's roto out some sky. So click that, and then just draw over the sky. Hopefully that picks it up pretty good. That looks pretty sweet. We can go in here and maybe just see if we can get this tower in there as well. That would be very, very neat. And we of course want to invert that because we selected the sky. That'll probably be fine. And let's go and see the results that we're getting here. And it's having a bit of trouble with some of the smoke and stuff like that, which isn't too big of a deal because it's going to be a pretty short scene. That looks sweet. Go back into our composition and then invert the foreground and background. And just like that, we have a little bit of the text in the background. Looks super sweet. Scale it up maybe a little bit and maybe move it up just a tiniest bit so it's a little bit more legible. Move that up there, just like that, kind of like in the distance. That looks so sweet. Now that we have all 3 of the sequences set up, we can drag them into a final composition where we can put them all together and add just a little bit of that sauce. So let's hit Command N to make a new composition. And then we will just name this main, and I will change it to a 1080 composition and change it to 23.976 frames per second. And let's just set it to something like 5 seconds because we want it to be pretty short and sweet, and hit OK. Now we can go back into this folder and drag that into our main, open that up so we can see it, and everything else we will drag into the pre-comps. This one, open it, hit Command K and name this scene 3 pre. And then we can go and drag this one. Let's drag it to the very beginning and just close all of these ones. And we will take scene 2, scene 3, and scene 1, drag them into a composition, scale them all down. Since all of these are 1080p compositions, we'll just scale them down like that. And let's play around with this just a little bit. So this first one, we want it to be pretty brief. We want it to start right about a starter right here. So we're just gonna trim that, and I'm gonna move it up here. And then the second one, let's drag that forward, and we will have just a little bit of this come in. Let's maybe right here is pretty good. Drag that in, and then in the end we want this, and we'll just trim this layer so that just one after the other. But we do have a little bit of spot here in the beginning, and for that I have a very special little intro sequence that I want in, and I'm going to scale that down, and I just want it to be super quick. And we will just find a spot that looks pretty good, maybe right here. So I'll split that, Shift Command D, delete that, move that up, and then we will trim it. Let's do right about here. So now we just have a little bit of a fast-paced motion to get into the sequence, and then it slows down. Just a little bit of a change of pace and a nice way to transition into it, I think. Just adds a little bit of that visual interest, which is super important in sequences like this. First of all, I want all of this to be black and white, so I'm gonna add an adjustment layer, and then we are gonna add a hue and saturation, and very simply just drag the saturation all the way down. And now we will go in and add a little bit of individual color grade to each of these. So if you select the layer and then use, in this case, I'm using FX Console, which is free, and then I'm gonna add Lumetri color, and that's just gonna allow me to play around with the contrast a little bit, get something that looks a little bit nicer, maybe drag the highlights up a little bit, and drag the shadows down a little bit to get a little bit of a punchier look. And go forward to the second scene, add another Lumetri color, and again, go into the basic corrections, play around with the exposure and the contrast a little bit to get something that looks pretty sweet. Then move forward to the next scene, another Lumetri color, and let's increase the contrast of this one a little bit, boost that up just a little bit, go forward to the last scene and another one. And I think I want to make the sky just a little bit brighter if I can. Increase the contrast, increase the highlights a little bit. I want to take this one, let's scale it up a little bit and get the framing a little bit more interesting. Let's place that right about here so we get that a little bit, boom. And the second one, also scale this one ever so slightly, just up a little bit, maybe place it a little bit higher like that. Go forward to the last scene and scale that up also ever so slightly and drag that down so should we get a little bit more sky. And then I'm gonna add another adjustment layer and add posterize time to it and set that to 12. And then we are gonna add another adjustment layer and add a transform effect to it. And I'm gonna take that and place it below the adjustment layer. If you don't want to get confused, Shift Command Y to open the solid settings and rename them to, this one will be shake, and this one will be posterize time, and this one is CC, color correction. And in the shake, you want to alt click the position and then like, let's add a posterize time, set that to 12, and then a wiggle. Let's do 1,10. We're just gonna give us just a little bit of camera shake, and you of course want to make sure you actually use a comma and not a period. Very important. And that gives us just a tiny bit of camera shake. And then we are gonna add a solid, so Command Y. We're gonna name this green. This is very important because this will really bring it all together, make it middle gray, so 80, 80, 80 for the hex code. And then we will add green and change it to final output, and then pick whichever preset you like. We're just gonna pick, let's do codec vision. And then I want the intensity to be pretty high, not that high, maybe something like 2, and then increase the size a good bit to something like maybe 1.3, might be a little bit more fitting. And then add a tint to make it black and white. And then we will pre-compose this and move all attributes into new composition and just name this grain pre, and change the blending mode to overlay, and then drag that below the posterize time. And I want it to be pretty grainy. I maybe even want it to be a little bit more grainy than this. So if I go in and maybe just increase the size a little bit to something like 1.5 and the softness to something like 1.2 and see what that looks like. I think I like that a lot better. And now we of course want to make sure in the shake that we increase the scale to something like 101. And then in the color correction, you can hit Shift Command Y and lock aspect ratio, and then increase it just a little bit just to make sure that we don't get any spills on the edges. That's just gonna look a little bit cleaner. And then maybe add a little bit of movement to some of these. So maybe hit S and P to bring up this composition, keyframe those, put it, let's do right about here, and move forward, and then scale it up a little bit. Maybe move it around just a tiny bit, spread them out just a little bit so we just get a little bit of movement going into that. And you can select these and hit F9 to ease the keyframes. And then we want to carry the momentum into this one a little bit since it is zoomed in. So if we open these up, we will take these last points and just drag them towards the end. Drag these out like that. Play that back so we can see it a little bit better. Get it zoomed in just a little bit, just kind of drags it right at the end. And we can even move these closer in so it just becomes a little bit more impactful. And if you want, enable motion blur, which is just a nice little movement into that. What we could do maybe is if we go into scene 2 and let's open up this, and then on our foreground add a drop shadow and set it to 180 and distance to 0, and then increase the softness a little bit. We could maybe add just a little bit of shadow to our text and then duplicate that and do shadow only, and then track that to our text. So add that, just like that. And now we should have just a little bit of shadow on that without it going on the everything else. And just like that, we have just a little bit of shadow on the text, which is just gonna immerse it a little bit more into the actual scene and just feel like it's actually there. And that is by far the most important step of all of this, is using the 3D camera tracking to make it feel like it's actually in the scene. And that's where something like the drop shadow really helps as well, to sell that it is actually behind the building as well. And you can do that with the other scenes as well. But that is pretty much it for this tutorial. Just a super simple technique taken to a whole different level by adding just a little bit more stylization and making it look just a little bit more saucy. Hopefully you enjoyed watching this video. Hopefully you learned something new and maybe inspired you to use this technique in some of your work. Definitely a beautiful way to just up the level just a little bit, which you can never go wrong with that. And then of course, black and white is always very, very sexy. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next week. Peace out.